If there is one name forever tied to the bloody stage of the French Revolution, it is Charles-Henri Sanson. Known as the Monsieur de Paris, he personally oversaw thousands of deaths during one of the most violent upheavals in European history. His role was both feared and necessary, the man who turned the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity into gruesome realities at the guillotine. But who was this man behind the blade? Was he simply a butcher, or something far more complicated, a reluctant professional trapped by duty and history? The Sanson family had already been in the execution business for generations. Charles-Henri was the fourth generation to inherit the position of executioner of Paris, taking the post in 1778 after his father fell ill. For centuries, this was not a job one applied for. It was an office passed down like a family curse. The Sansons had carried out executions since the reign of Louis XIV, and Charles-Henri himself would become the most infamous of them all. At first, his career was fairly typical for an executioner of the Ancien Regime. Before the Revolution, death sentences were fewer, usually reserved for severe crimes such as murder, treason, or heresy. Punishments were varied and often gruesome: hanging, breaking on the wheel, burning, or quartering. The executioner's job required skill, precision, and a chilling composure. Charles-Henri Sanson gained a reputation for professionalism, even a strange sort of dignity. Yet when the revolution exploded in 1789, his world and his workload changed forever. The revolution demanded a new kind of justice: fast, public, and symbolic. In 1792, France adopted the guillotine as the official method of execution. It was hailed as a more humane instrument than the axe or sword, because it promised a quick, equal death for noble and commoner alike. But it also transformed execution into a spectacle of mass politics. And no one was more closely tied to that spectacle than Charles-Henri Sanson. He oversaw the guillotine's very first test on April 25, 1792, when a highwayman named Nicolas Pelletier became its inaugural victim. Sanson himself noted how curious the crowd was, almost excited to see the machine in action. That day marked the beginning of an era where the guillotine would dominate public life in France, and Sanson would stand at the center of it. Of course, his most famous act was the execution of King Louis XVI. On January 21, 1793, Sanson led the deposed monarch to the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution. Louis XVI had been tried and condemned for treason against the French people. As thousands watched in tense silence, Sanson performed his duty. Accounts say the king attempted to speak, but the roll of drums drowned his words. Moments later, Sanson's guillotine blade fell, ending centuries of Bourbon rule. In a brief statement afterward, Sanson declared simply that he had carried out his orders and that Louis had met his fate with courage. For Sanson, it was the execution that defined his career and placed him at the heart of revolutionary history. He had killed a king, not as a murderer, but as the executor of the people's will. But the executions did not end there. Over the next 2 years, the revolution descended into the terror. The guillotine became a daily presence in Paris. Nobles, priests, revolutionaries, and ordinary citizens alike marched to their deaths. It was Charles-Henri Sanson and his assistants who kept the blade falling. Estimates vary, but it is believed that Sanson personally executed around 3,000 people during the Revolution, while his family oversaw many thousands more. Among his most notable victims were Queen Marie Antoinette, revolutionary leaders Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre, and countless others whose names history has forgotten. Each day, Sanson's cart rolled through the streets, carrying prisoners to their final appointment. The crowd watched as heads rolled into the wicker basket, blood soaking the wooden planks of the scaffold. Children clambered onto their parents' shoulders for a better view. Street vendors sold snacks nearby. In a strange way, executions had become a kind of civic ritual, and Sanson was the central performer. Yet behind the scenes, Charles-Henri Sanson was not the cold-hearted monster many imagined. Letters and memoirs attributed to him suggest he was deeply conflicted. He viewed his job as a duty rather than a pleasure. He was meticulous, ensuring executions were carried out swiftly to minimize suffering. And he kept records that showed both pride in his professionalism and horror at the scale of death he was required to administer. One remarkable moment came during the trial of Louis XVI. Sanson actually signed a petition requesting the king's life be spared, arguing that executing a monarch could plunge France into deeper chaos. His request was ignored, and he dutifully carried out the sentence. But this act shows that he was more than a machine operator. He was a man grappling with the weight of history. Sanson's role also reveals the paradox of the revolution. The guillotine was meant to embody equality in death, everyone punished in the same way, no matter their rank. But in practice, it became a tool of political control and mass terror. And it was Sanson who had to enact this contradiction day after day. Imagine the psychological toll, guiding nobles in silken gowns and peasants in rags to the same scaffold, knowing the blade would erase their differences in an instant. To the crowd, he was an agent of justice. To himself, perhaps, he was merely a servant of fate, compelled by birth and duty. After the fall of Robespierre in 1794, the pace of execution slowed. The terror ended, and France entered a new phase. Sanson remained executioner until 1795, when he retired and handed the role to his son, Henri. He had served nearly 40 years in the post, becoming a reluctant symbol of France's darkest chapter. Charles-Henri Sanson died in 1806, quietly and away from the scaffold. Yet his legacy endures in history books, memoirs, and the public imagination. To some, he remains a grim executioner. To others, he is a tragic figure, a man born into a role he could not escape, who found himself the hand of revolutionary justice. So what do we make of Charles-Henri Sanson today? Was he a villain or a victim of circumstance? Perhaps both. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, violence, and human responsibility. After all, revolutions are not fought only in speeches and pamphlets. They are enforced in blood by men like Sanson, who stand on the scaffold with no choice but to act. Charles-Henri Sanson's story reminds us that history is not shaped only by kings and philosophers, but also by those who carry out orders, however terrible they may be. It forces us to ask, what would we do in his place? Could we resist, or would we too bend beneath the weight of duty and survival? As we reflect on the revolution's promise of liberty and equality, we cannot forget the cost at which those ideals were pursued. The guillotine fell thousands of times, and with each fall, Charles-Henri Sanson stood as the reluctant hand of history. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, don't let it end here. Share this video, leave your thoughts below, and let's discuss together. Was Sanson a monster, a servant, or simply a man trapped in the machinery of revolution? And if you want to keep exploring the untold corners of history, make sure you're subscribed. Because the past has many more stories waiting, stories that will challenge us, shock us, and most of all, make us think.